Hello and welcome to this discussion of women, politics and the press, the first of two panels live streamed today as part of our Festival of Women Writers and Journalists, a centenary celebration of Time and Tide. My name is Catherine Clay and I'm Director of the Time and Tide Connections and Legacies project. I'm delighted that so many people have joined us this afternoon to learn more about the history of this remarkable feminist magazine and to consider the status of women in journalism today. Founded in May 1920, Time and Tide was unique in establishing itself as the only female-edited weekly review in Britain, competitive with the New Statesman, and it vigorously championed women's equality with men in public and political life. 100 years on, I'm excited by the opportunity in this panel to consider how far we have come since Time and Tide's first publication, particularly with regard to spheres of print journalism from which women have been historically excluded. It's my huge pleasure, therefore, to introduce our chair of this panel, Dr. Sarah Lonsdale, Senior Lecturer in Journalism at City University, London. Sarah has been a journalist for 25 years, starting out on the Reading Chronicle and then the Observer newspaper as a general reporter. She continues to write freelance for numerous magazines and newspapers. Sarah is also author of two books on the history of journalism, the second of which, Rebel Women Between the Wars, is just out with Manchester University Press. Our pre-recorded festival programme includes a short presentation by Sarah from this book, and I warmly encourage you to take a look at this if you haven't done so already. For now, I will hand you over to Sarah, who will introduce our panellists. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So the aim of this panel is to interrogate the status of women in the spheres of print journalism, particularly in areas that they've been excluded from traditionally, which is science journalism, politics, and foreign affairs. And just to provide you some context, the Women in Journalism campaign group did a survey of major national newspapers over the summer, and they found that of all newspaper front page bylines over a period that they looked at in the summer, that only 1/4 were female authored. And that's extraordinary to think that women have been journalists on public newspapers for a very long time. So also in Women in Journalism's survey, they found that of 111 people interviewed on newspaper front pages, only 16% were women, and also of those 111 people quoted, only one was a Black woman. And Eleanor Mills, the chair of Women in Journalism, said obviously that this has got to change, that newspapers simply don't reflect society's diversity. So with me to discuss these issues are Polly Toynbee, the social and political commentator at The Guardian, formerly social affairs editor at the BBC, and author of several books, including the most recent, The Lost Decade, 2010 to 2020, and also Hard Work, Life in Low-Pay Britain. I also have great pleasure in introducing Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, formerly deputy editor of the New Statesman, and author of Difficult Women, a history of feminism in 11 fights, that was published earlier this year, and Emily Wilson, the first ever woman editor of the New Scientist magazine, the first woman editor in its 62-year history, and formerly assistant editor of The Guardian. So just to let you know how we're going to do this, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to be taking questions for about 15 minutes that you can submit through the YouTube chat. So I'm going to be kicking off with looking at journalism now and what the state of journalism as it was 100 years ago when Time and Tide was first launched. And I've asked the panelists to choose their favourite piece from this fantastic souvenir edition of Time and Tide. And very interestingly, two of our panelists, Emily and Polly, both chose the same piece, which was an article by the writer Winifred Holtby, and it was titled Feminism Divided. And clearly, because it spoke to 2 out of 3 of our panelists very powerfully, it's a good place to start. So, Polly, can I ask you first why you chose this piece by Winifred Holtby?
Well, as this Time and Tide is such a lovely, beautiful, it's not exactly a replica because it's a compilation. So here's Winifred Holtby's piece. I'm a huge fan of Winifred Holtby. She's one of the few people to have written a really great book about local government, a subject much, a really great novel, South Riding. She was a terrific feminist, great friend of Vera Britton's. This is a piece that goes right to the heart of, I think, anybody who's been involved in any feminist movement ever. This is called Feminism Divided, and it always is. There are always battles between old feminists, new feminists, young feminists. Every generation kind of reinvents feminism for themselves. And here she is saying she's an old feminist, and these new feminists, who might be these days be called the equivalent of lipstick feminists, are not the real thing. She wants to fight the old fights. She wants to make sure that, you know, for equal pay, for all those basic things that we still haven't got. And she thinks the new feminists are going soft. I mean, I've always been very careful myself not to get involved in these internal battles because, you know, the cat fights that are mocked by our natural enemies of every sort of feminism, seems to me we should spend a lot less time. I mean, the recent one, of course, is the trans battle over trans and what it is to be a woman. I've not got involved in that because, again, I think it utterly destructive of the real battles that we really need to fight and win. And I can't bear to see good feminist causes torn apart and waylaid by these disputes. So I find it interesting that here was Winifred Holtby back then involved in these same old battles that we should try and avoid.
Thank you, Polly. And just picking you up on what you said, so you said we shouldn't be distracted from the battles that we've really got to win. You know, what would you say today are the main battles that women have yet to win?
I'd say it's still about half-made revolution. Equal pay is the most obvious and the one you can count best. But the fact that it's still women who look after children, the fact it's still women whose careers step back when couples have children, tend to go part-time. Most of them never catch up again at the career place they were at before, while their husbands go on ahead in their career, or at least earning more money, if not advancement. I think the fact that when you look at what women do, the great bulk of women are still at the foot of the ladder for pay. They are in care, they're in catering, they're in cashiers as in supermarkets. They are in low-paid jobs, and the jobs are low-paid because they're done by women. It's a kind of circularity. They're disrespected jobs. It's disrespected work because it's regarded as women cleaners as well as carers. And so all of that still has to be turned upside down until we respect the importance of that work that's done. Women will be disrespected, and so will their work be.
Thank you. And so, Emily, why did you choose Winifred Holtby's piece?
For exactly the same reasons as Polly. And if I'd gone first, I would have been just as erudite. No, I agree completely with what Polly said. And I found the piece comforting. I do feel sort of increasing despair over what feel like sort of worse and more bitter divides between feminists and between, you know, women I love and have formerly always agreed with on things. So I found this comforting, that this is the sort of thing that has gone. I remember when I sort of first became aware of what feminism really was, I think there were divides. It was over, you know, sex work or this or that, but it feels worse now. But I found this comforting.
Brilliant. So Helen, you chose a very different piece. You chose a piece in the correspondence columns about the Scottsboro case. Can you tell viewers just a little bit about the Scottsboro case and why you were drawn to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an open letter, a format that I normally abhor and disdain. But in this case, I think it's a really interesting historical monument. This is from 1933. The lead signatory is Nancy Cunard. And there are some names on here that will be very familiar to people. You know, Rebecca West, the great feminist, Ezra Pound, famously later poet and anti-Semite, Honourable Brian Guinness, you know, the first husband of Diana Mitford, later married to Oswald Mosley. So it's a kind of interesting who's who of the early 1930s. But the Scottsboro case is one, again, it's interesting that both Polly and Emily brought up, you know, the way that history speaks to today. For me, it's why I'm always so interested in history. The Scottsboro Boys case was a case about on a train, and 9 African-American teenagers were accused of raping 2 white women. Now, it was a completely jumped up charge. One of the complainants revealed during the second trial that she'd been pressured, essentially, you know, bullied into making this up by white men that she knew. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled particularly about all white juries and how terrible that was to have justice done by people, you know, not by a jury of their peers. And I think it's a really interesting case. It came up, I mentioned it in something that I wrote earlier this year about the word Karen and this insult that is used now on the internet, which is a very online, very Twitter based, oh, you're such a Karen. But what it's got is some roots in there about the difference between white women and ethnic minority men. And actually, where's the power differentiation? Does being white cancel out the disadvantage of being a woman? And those really difficult questions that we now call intersectionality, and the way that different oppressions rub up and against each other. And therefore, I thought it was really interesting that is a case which still has such resonance today. And to me, that's the point of studying history, is to say, hey, but this has all happened before. These are not new questions. We're maybe grappling with them in new language, but you know, these forces are really long-standing.
Absolutely. No, there's lots of change, and yet nothing has changed. And actually, that speaks to the piece I chose, which was a piece in the news section of Time and Tide, which was about Amy Johnson, the Flyers solo flight from London to Australia. 12,000 miles, a huge achievement, and it was reported very soberly in Time and Tide. They celebrate her courage, her determination, and also her technical skills. She had to be really good at fixing engines and that kind of thing. And they say, you know, this is why it's so absurd to say that, you know, women can't do what men can do. Of course they can. And what's interesting to me is the way Time and Tide covered that piece about Amy Johnson compared to the popular newspapers at the time. So for a start, they called her a diminutive, beautiful girl flyer, and they whipped up a non-existent cat fight between Amy Johnson and another woman pilot, Peggy Salomon. Again, it's this sort of but often belittling of women who make the public eye, and you know, you can see that actually happening today, can't we, with Kamala Harris. I think it was one of our great national newspapers who described her beauty routine or something like that in the aftermath of her becoming the first woman vice president and black woman vice president of the United States. So now we're going to perhaps take a little step back, halfway back, and I'm going to ask Polly, who the oldest member of our panel, who became a journalist in 1968, and ask you, Polly, what has changed? I'm sure things have changed since you started out as a journalist in 1968.
A lot has changed. I mean, there was only one woman in the lobby, one woman political correspondent, who was Nora Beloff of the Observer, and she was regarded universally as a virago, a battle axe, every kind of, you know, old stereotype of a tough old older woman. But she was very well respected, and she hung in there. But you know, she was the only one. Nearly all of the women journalists, if they were on the serious side, if they weren't doing, you know, the fashion and the soft features, if they were on the news side, were doing social. you were steered towards, education and health and maybe housing, things like that. You didn't do politics and you didn't do economics. Now I look at The Guardian, we have a woman editor, we have a woman political editor, we have a woman environmental editor, we have nearly all, actually most of our political correspondents are women too. It's been extraordinary. At one point we had a job share for political editor between two women, and that would have been absolutely unthinkable. I mean, it's still pretty exceptional, but you've got Laura Kuenssberg, and I mean, nobody any longer says women can't think right about politics. I suppose what has not changed, abuse of women journalists online is extraordinary, and it does show the extent to which they're still not really accepted. And women get far more, women writers get far more abuse than men do, and that's been quantified in quite a lot of research. You are much more, the abuse that you get says, you obviously don't know anything about what you're talking about, you stupid woman, why don't you push off, and much ruder than that. Still out there, an underlying sense that you're not up to it, you're not really serious, in a way that when I look at male columnists don't get half as much as we female columnists do.
Yes, so some progress in some areas, but as you say, in our making progress, we've also faced a certain degree of jeopardy, particularly online abuse, and I'm really interested to sort of understand why women who put themselves out there, who put themselves in the public sphere, do seem to be so much more of a target than men. And Helen, you wanted to talk about this particularly.
Do I? I'm not sure I always do. Well, I totally agree with Polly that it is exactly that. It is the idea that somehow you're illegitimate. Your presence in public life is provisional, and I think frankly a lot of it is this kind of form of misogynistic resentment. The kind of, well, hang on a minute, how have you got this job? Why don't I have this job? And that's sort of against the natural order of things. And it's a reflection of how quickly society has changed, that there are men who are feeling a lot more competition than they once did. They're fundamentally competing against a much bigger field than they did. But I think there's also some other related things, which I think that journalists have been encouraged more to see themselves as a kind of personal mini industry. And that hasn't necessarily been particularly good for women. There's a huge premium on very, very opinionated writing and people presenting themselves as kind of stars. But that also means that you're a lot more exposed. You're not writing as the voice of an institution, you're writing as yourself. And with that comes down, I think, a lot more abuse. And then the second thing that, I feel odd that I'm the one speaking about this because I don't have children, but I think there's a huge maternity gap in journalism. Perhaps the biggest thing, I think, as Polly was saying, that is, my journalism course that I did as a postgraduate was just about majority female. My English course at university was majority female. You look around and there is, I used to hire for the New Statesman, absolutely no problem with 20-something women. They're amazing, coming out of your ears. You couldn't hire all of them that there possibly are. And then something happens, and that something is by and large children. And what happens is when you look around at 40, the field has incredibly thinned because it's a very precarious job in lots of senses. It often has very odd hours, very strange demands are made at you. It's very hard for you to kind of demand to be able to switch off. You're supposed to be on your WhatsApp at all hours of the day and night. And for a lot of women still, that is a bargain that they cannot make to juggle that with children. And I don't know, I mean, there's a piece about men doing more, certainly, about it, but is it possible to have, if you're in a heterosexual two-earner couple, is it possible for both of you to be journalists? I think that's and juggle that with kids, it's a really hard thing to make add up, I think. And lots of women are just saying, sorry, no, I'm going to go and work in corporate communications or whatever it might be, because then I know when I finish work for the day, I'm done. Like, that's all you can be expected to ask for me. And that's the big hurdle I would now say for women in journalism is your 30s.
Yeah, no, there's a terrible shedding of talent there. But obviously women have made it to the top, including Emily. And Emily, I wanted to ask you, you're obviously a boss now, you're an editor, and you manage other journalists. Do you think it's made any difference? I mean, how do you think you operate as an editor compared to, say, a male editor, in terms of just how your personnel are deployed and their workload and all that sort of thing? Yeah, can you tell us how you think things have changed when women get to these positions of authority?
Can I just say back to what Helen and Polly were saying first, which is that the only reason I'm editor of New Scientist now is that The Guardian supported me through my 30s, where I, had kids, was away 2 years on maternity leave. And The Guardian kind of supported me in doing job shares and awkward things. But and I have to thank for everything, but it was still very easy working in the newsroom there for kind of a couple of key people to be away, and I would be the only woman in a room full of men, just because of the legacy, the legacy issue of most people being men and they need to go through the industry before they come up. But also, I still think in many newsrooms there's still quite a macho feeling about the big jobs. You can't do those in a sort of flexible way. The really big jobs, you have to be there every day, and that kind of underlying machismo that does put women off, ends up sort of shedding women who want to work flexibly through their, whenever it is, 30s. That's all still there and it's still going on. I'm just really lucky that my kids are old enough now I can work full time again, and that I didn't get off-ramped in my 30s, which just happens all the time to so many people. To the management thing, I don't know, people do talk about men and women managing differently, but when I think about sort of who I would like to be as a manager, it is a man that I envisage, a man I work for, who I found an exceptional, nuanced, thoughtful, consensual boss. So I think that the difficulty you have as a woman manager is sort of overcoming, and I have now that I'm 50, but for a long time, sort of overcoming your imposter syndrome and not being able to model yourself on anyone in a similar role is always difficult. And it's also particularly then the sort of kind of first stages of things, when you become the first woman boss of something, or for the first woman, I became the first woman boss of many teams before I did New Scientist. And then you've always got, kind of sullen sea of men not delighted, few people not really showing their delight very obviously. And so then you start questioning your own style, and are you doing it differently from how a man would? But I don't have the data to know, do men and women manage differently? I only know that people manage well or badly, and that there is, corporate style probably eclipses any gender differences, I would think.
Yeah. And Polly, you what do you think? Do you think that having more women at the top of newspapers has made a difference? Well,
there's always the Margaret Thatcher problem. Simply putting a woman somewhere doesn't necessarily. We have a woman editor at the Guardian after many years of promoting women, and she is a woman who herself has promoted many women throughout her career. She was head of the New York, of the American office. She's been head of the Australian office, and she is absolutely not Margaret Thatcher type. But when you look at the women who have been editors, who made the great breakthroughs, what did they edit? The News of the World, the Sunday Express. Is Rebecca Brooks anybody's idea of a role model? So the idea that any one particular woman is necessarily going to fix things or solve problems or change the world isn't the way it goes. It's really when you get enough women in positions of seniority in an organization that the culture starts to shift. What matters changes, what people worry about changes, what kind of employer you are changes. So it's not the single star who's editing the News of the World that changes the culture of the News of the World. Alas, well, she did in a way, because it's gone, through what she did. But So I think one has to be careful about pinning too much on any one person, and it is just a general, when we get to 50-50 everywhere, we may find a cultural change.
When in New Scientist, it's not just about having a woman editor now. We've also got a female CEO, female head of marketing, female head of news. About half the senior journalists are women, and probably 2/3 of the directors of the company women. So when you get to those sort of proportions, it does start feeling really different.
Yeah, and Helen, you've been looking back into history, and I mean, obviously we've all seen The Devil Wears Prada, and we've seen that sort of awful archetype of the female woman, the woman editor who treats her underlings with absolute disregard. Helen, do you think that in the past, particularly when women were just a few of them and they were all struggling to make their way, that they had to behave in a sort of unsisterly way?
I think that if you look at the kind of, from a sort of evolutionary perspective, like it's natural selection, what did that environment, and Polly will know this far better than me, what did the environment in the 1970s say in journalism select for? It selected for people who were, including women, extremely self-confident, able to withstand a huge amount of pressure. When I was writing this book, I kept thinking about those great early female columnists, people like Jean Rook, who wrote a terrible piece, as far as I'm concerned, about the Alvino case, when women wanted just merely to get served at the bar. And she said, it was pathetic whining, and she'd never had any problems getting a job from a man. It was, it was kind of that peak kind of, well, I'm all right, so how can feminism be needed stuff. And I thought, well, that was the kind of woman who was selected for in that environment, somebody who was just incredibly tough. And that probably manifested a lot of saying, why are all these other women complaining so much? Look, I'm here, I haven't got any problems. So I think you have to apply a certain level of, not kindness, but just certainly just awareness that was the way that things worked. And I think what Emily says is entirely true, actually, because what does a newsroom do above anything else? It decides what's interesting. And so it will always be a reflection of the people in that room. And if you're the only woman in that room saying, I think quite a lot of people during the pandemic are quite worried about their childcare, and everybody else has got a stay-at-home wife, you're not going to kind of get anywhere. But if you're in an office where quite a lot of dads, take half the responsibilities, or where, you've got a much more even gender split, then actually lots of other people are going to agree with you that maybe is an interesting thing that you probably should write about. But that's where the change comes. And I agree entirely with Polly that we've had this problem where we put too many expectations on single women to be able to change the world. And then everyone has piled in and given them an enormous kicking when they haven't, surprisingly enough, just on their own been able to do that.
Yeah, and that goes actually to my next question, which is, we all celebrate the fact that women are doing better in journalism, that in some areas, as we said, we do have now 50-50 representation, but what does that achieve? So, what does having more women writing on mainstream newspapers and magazines actually do for women and for society as a whole? So, Polly, if I could ask you that first. Polly?
I think she's
I don't know if you can hear me, but the sound has gone and I can't hear Sarah. It's
okay.
The screen is frozen.
I will put that question then to Emily. What do you think actually having a...
Well, obviously it's like, a lot less weird.
I can't hear anything.
You can, one of our so-called competitors, Scientific American, I can't remember the exact words on the cover. It was this year. It was like women. So it wasn't what makes them tick, but it was something like that, talking about women as the other. And you just know that there was no way that was a 50-50 gender split team that put out that really odd cover. So it's just, so on a simple level, it makes good business sense if you want a wide range of people to pay for your content, for it to reflect the interests, thoughts and feelings of a wide range of people and not be really weird about some of them.
Yes, and I suppose also that, as you say, so many more people, not just not just women, but men as well, are now interested in, the issues that were traditionally sort of women's areas. But I just wanted to ask you, Helen, about many women, don't they? They start off their journalistic careers in this sort of feminine pigeonhole. Maybe they write about health or fashion or childcare or that. And that's normally sort of the traditional route then into more sort of mainstream journalism. Is there a danger that women starting out and sort of writing for these traditionally female areas, that they're going to get pigeonholed?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And I think I have a very conflicted relationship with this. I mean, I never wanted to write about those things, although I'm reasonably interested in quite a lot of them, because I did feel that was, not taken seriously in the same way. But I don't think that's not right, is it? That's not something that we should all buy into. And I do think there is a seriousness gap where things that are associated with men are seen as serious and things that are associated with women are seen as frivolous. And my favorite juxtaposition of this, if you can see it very clearly in newspapers, is if you write about fashion, that is seen to be that you are a kind of trivial person. You don't have any big thoughts to air. If you write about football, however, that's, wow, it's a big sport. There's lots to say about it. You can be one of these people who gets £150,000 a year because, your prose about someone kicking a ball in one direction or another is seen as being so wonderful that you're a huge asset. Now, that's because, newspaper football coverage is incredibly popular. But guess what? So is newspaper features coverage, which has traditionally been the feminine part of the paper. David English, one of the former editors of the Daily Mail, was absolutely obsessed with the features because he knew he had got a majority female audience, and that was what sold the paper just as much as the kind of, strong right-wing news angle that he had on the front page. But because it's women doing it, it's like Polly saying about women's jobs become poorly paid jobs. Women's interests become dismissed as frivolous interests. And there is no reason why fashion, which is a multi-billion-dollar global business and an artistic creation, should be inherently dismissed as frippery, whereas football, which is a multi-billion-dollar global business and something that lots and lots of people enjoy doing in their leisure time, is somehow seen as authentic and proper and doesn't diminish you as a serious person.
Absolutely. Emily, what about you? What do you think about this? I don't know, when you started out, were you ever pigeonholed into sort of writing about women's issues?
I was just a general news reporter, so at the time I was the Mirror's only girl reporter. So I was always doing, so this is the sort of mid to late 90s. So I was always doing stunts. I was always having to dress up as a girl chauffeur to drive a lottery winner around, or sort of abseil down a cliff with my bum smaller then, my bum in the picture to go and, interview an activist up a tree. So it wasn't pigeonholed into the women's interest, but I was certainly appeared dressed up as a fool in the paper more often, I would say, than my male colleagues. And maybe this is right or wrong, but I've only worked at 3 different newspapers, but there wasn't the sort of traditionally sort of blokey, your sort of, I don't know, diplomatic corps or the politics jobs or all those kinds of jobs. The real thing that stopped women going for them, in my experience, was always they were seen as all-consuming big jobs, and you couldn't do it if you were kind of juggling childcare. That was the problem. I was mostly at The Guardian for 18 years. It wasn't that they wouldn't have wanted a woman in those roles. It was they didn't have enough women, didn't have a pool of women who wanted to work like that, or could work like that at those bits of their life. Being a war correspondent, you pay an enormous toll, enormous personal toll anyway, and never mind doing it with kids, for example.
Absolutely. Yes. We got Polly back, I think.
Yes, I'm back.
Okay. So obviously, all of us here on this panel, we're all over 25. Maybe we're all over all over 30. So when we all started out as journalists, we were very much in a minority as women. And I just wanted to ask you how you felt entering this profession where you were in such a minority. I'll just kick off with my own. I have to just tell you my own experience. So I started as a cub reporter on the Reading Chronicle, and this was in the late 1980s. My news editor was a lovely chap, but he could not compute the idea of a girl, a young woman, news reporter, and he was actually dead set against employing me. But I started getting front page scoops and that kind of thing, and so the way he got round it, he just called me Bert. He just called me. He made me an honorary bloke, and that was the way that I got along with him, and he got along with me, and I put up with that because that was the way I was going to get my stories respected. So, Polly, obviously, starting out in the 60s, you were even more in a minority. How did you feel? I mean, did people say, "What on earth are you doing, being a journalist"?
No, it was in the Observer, and so it was more subtle than that. There was just a nudge and a push all the time towards the softer stories and not being given the harder things to do. In the end, I got round that. I went off for a bit and I wrote a book about work, about manual work called A Working Life. And when I came back, I then began to be given industrial labour relations stories, because I'd spent a lot of time on factory floors, and in those days, in the 70s, strikes were it. And any news reporter had to know the rule books of every trade union, and I worked my way into that. But I would always find myself as the only woman covering a strike in a steelworks or whatever, and being treated by other journalists with absolute, you see, girl, you're not going to understand any of this. What do you think you're doing here? A general sense that you absolutely, this is really a man's world, the world of industrial relations and work, and push off. I mean, sometimes they'd be very patronizing and give you a helping hand in the way that they might not have done to a male a male reporter. But mostly, sometimes it was quite helpful, because some people didn't count you. So you would listen to what management was saying or what the strike committee was saying. And it was as if you weren't in the room, because you didn't count, you couldn't. And then if you did actually write down what they said and reported it, they'd be rather shocked because they thought you hadn't counted. As if you were the tea maker, the secretary.
It was also, wasn't it, in the 1970s that we have had the first ever woman president of the National Union of Journalists, and I read a piece about her where when she went to give her first address at the conference, she was greeted by heckles of "Get your knickers down." So yeah, and that was other journalists as well. So Emily, how did you start out, and how did you feel about being in a minority?
I started out 4 years at the Mirror, and and then Piers Morgan became editor, sort of booted me out, roughly speaking, and then I did 2 years at the Mail before I went to the Guardian as a refugee from the tabloids. But broadly speaking, in those sort of 6 years I did on tabloids, I didn't feel it was quite fair, in that if you were a rapacious predator willing to sink your teeth into your prey and get the story, you were fated and sent champagne. So it felt quite fair in that way. The only thing at the Mail that the 2 years I was there, Paul Dacre was editor, and there were funny rules about women. So he didn't like women eating at their desk. He wanted us to wear skirt suits, not trouser suits. So there was still some overhangs accompanying his unusual character.
Sorry, Emily, but were men allowed to eat at their desks?
Yeah, he didn't think it was ladylike. I mean, all this thing was sort of passed down through the all-male news desks that then existed. So he never came over and said it to me himself, but it was the law, LORE. It was what it was said to be. Yeah.
Yes. There was a flip side to, and not to turn this into the Paul Dacre reminiscence half hour, but I worked at the Mail too for 5 years, and there was also a sense in which that you were tactically used against male news editors. So, for example, when I worked on the features desk, when there was a story that was particularly controversial, we thought I might have a bad reaction, I was kind of sent in on the basis that he wouldn't be that rude to a woman. So you were sort of tactically deployed with the small chivalry gene, hopefully going to be activated. But I was thinking about, I mean, I don't know if this is an experience maybe that people coming in their 20s will have, but yeah, I'm 37 now, and I've still never had a female line manager. I've never had I mean, I haven't worked that many different places, but I think that's the bit that we don't necessarily notice, is just how fundamentally male all the structures are. And actually, I think you would really notice if you were a young man coming in and your career was as female dominated as mine has been male dominated, you would feel that was still very unusual and very weird. And part of the project of me writing this book was all about saying these things that we have kind of accepted, that because they've been the structures that have been in place all your life, are actually quite strange and quite weird. And I think that's something in journalism that we just don't realize quite how male it is, because it's always been male. That's just a sort of natural universal state of journalism as far as most people who've worked in it are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I did want to just we've talked briefly about the internet in terms of how perhaps on social media particularly women have been targeted more than men, but also obviously the internet has been a huge advance, you know, in terms of how you research your stories and that kind of thing. And I just wanted to end up by asking you, obviously Time and Tide was printed on gorgeous kind of creamy note paper, and now lots of publications are digital, and lots of journalists obviously, and have to in the last few months anyway, done all their research using the internet. Has the internet played any role, do we think, in the way women have advanced in journalism? Emily, has it helped you in any way or changed the way you operate?
I know it's much easier to check stuff. When I got to The Guardian, I probably may remember this, in 2000, which doesn't sound that long ago, does it? You had to put your name down on a list if you wanted access to the computer, which had, I can't remember if it was Yahoo or Dolphin or something. You had to queue up to get an access to the online library, which was the internet. So I don't know, it's made journalism a more thrilling place, hasn't it? And given us an entire other world to explore and write stories about. Has it helped me? I don't know. It certainly helps me right now during a pandemic that I can edit a mag from home for however long, 8 months or whatever it's been. And it's the first time in my life I haven't commuted. So that's all. So yes, thank you, internet.
Yeah. I mean, I remember doing, when I was doing sort of health features, actually having to go to a specific health library somewhere in Holborn and asking for journals and taking me sort of 3 or 4 days to find something you could find at a touch of a button now. But, Helen, what about you? Obviously, you work for The Atlantic. Have you noticed a change in the way you operate, or do you think journalism is changing as a result of this online world we have at our fingertips?
I mean, it's changed enormously, and one of the most obvious ways that shows up is the fact that Facebook and Google have essentially a duopoly on online advertising. You know, the small ads and the classifieds that would have supported local newspapers, even when I was a teenager, have gone. All that money has gone out of journalism, and display advertising pays pennies for thousands of page views in a way that you were able to sell a newspaper or a magazine like Time and Tide for a reasonable amount of money that was enough to pay journalists a reasonable salary. And so journalism has become a lot more precarious as a job. It's also become a lot more middle class as a job. You know, I was working with people at the start of my career who had left school at 16 and had to do a mandatory 2 years of working on local papers before they were allowed to Fleet Street under union rules. That doesn't happen anymore. It's not just university graduates, it's usually postgraduates now who are coming in then graduate schemes. And they're often working in incredibly fast-paced environments, you know, churning out huge numbers of stories a day. Because, as Emily says, the problem is it being very quick to check stuff, is it's also very quick to spin up some stories out of some flam you found on social media. So we have these two twin things going on, that everybody talks more about the stuff that's happening online in this sort of weird global community, particularly very dominated by America. And there's less and less attention paid to things that are happening at the end of your street. You know, the courts are incredibly undercovered now, for example, because all of that local journalism has died. And, you know, that's got different effects in a gender way. You know, I think it's been really good for female freelancers, of whom there are a huge number, to be able to work from home, and even before the pandemic. And we really could actually now take more advantage of the ability for people not to have to live in very expensive cities like London and still do some journalism jobs, which would help with the incredible endemic problem that journalism has of being dominated by the top sections of societies, including those who can afford to live with their parents in London for several years working low-paid jobs. So, the internet story has been a very depressing one to my mind, but I'm hopeful that something can be salvaged from it.
Thank you. And so just to wrap up then, Polly, just taking that on, I mean, do we hope that, women's position in journalism, I mean, as Helen said, it may be that as it gets a more precarious profession, you may, ironically, have more women in it as men go to the sort of safer, better paid jobs. Can you see a joyful future for women journalists?
Yes, I think so. There's been such huge advances. I think there will be more and more women. Their voices will be taken more and more seriously. They're in every single field. I mean, look at Emily. I think it's going to improve. It's going to go on getting better. I don't think there's anywhere in that. I think the class question will be the next, will become more pressing than the question of women in journalism, not in general, but in journalism. I think so. I think what Helen says is right. It's very, very middle class dominated. To have to get a postgraduate degree, to have to start out with, no money in mostly in London. You need backing behind you, and I think that'll be a bigger issue. So I'm optimistic about women. Yes.
Hooray.
If we conquer this battle, the gender bit, then we can start focusing on different kinds of diversity, and we will. I agree.
Excellent. So we've got questions, a lot of questions actually. So I'm going to read them out in the order I've been sent them, and I suppose just leap in or put your hand up or something if more than one of you wants to answer. So Jeffrey Reed asks us, actually I'm going to ask each of you in turn, starting with you, Emily, as you're on my screen. Which female journalist has inspired you the most?
I guess Kath Viner, who's the editor of The Guardian, because I'm not sure anyone in the world has really inspired me per se, but I'll pick out Kath because if it wasn't Kath, I wouldn't be in my job now. When I was sort of like a kind of like middling minion on the features desk with a baby, she's the person who kind of helped me put together my first job share and allowed me to go on to years of job sharing, which allowed me to not off ramp. So and she was so she was truly inspiring in the way she supported women, even though it was a pain in her butt to have a job sharing deputy, and also she was inspirational in it sounds like a small thing, but she would never send a page of the newspaper without having read every single word on it down to the last full stop, and that was very very good advice in particular.
Wonderful. Helen, which women journalist has inspired you the most?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, one of them being Nellie Bly, who, a great 20th century journalist, who got herself committed to what was then called an insane asylum to expose the conditions that were in it. But there's a great tradition, particularly in America, of female essayists that I really love. So I'm thinking of Joan Didion, Janet Malcolm, women who went through at that time when that was a superbly blokey area, long form journalism, where it was considered, the boys' domain. And they just, through the sheer brilliance of their, acuity and what they wrote about, they bulldozed their way into it. And that's the tradition that I love to think that I am writing in, hopefully.
Fantastic. Polly?
I choose somebody very unlike me, Claire Hollingworth, war correspondent. She happened to be, she was lucky, she happened to be on the border when the German tanks rolled into Poland, and she saw it and she reported it. First, they refused to believe it. It can't be happening, it can't be true. But she persuaded her editor, they published the story, and she absolutely indefatigable war correspondent throughout her life, and I interviewed her towards the end of her life, and she was remarkable. So it took incredible women of extraordinary bravery who just battered their way through, you wouldn't call it a glass ceiling, but every obstacle in their way, and showed that women can do it. She was the kind of Amy Johnson equivalent, perhaps, for war correspondence.
Yes, absolutely. The tanks are coming from Poland into Poland. Yes. Okay, so Margaret Hughes asks, again, probably a quick answer from all three of you. In terms of starting out, what would you advise young women, indeed any woman who joins journalism today? Any advice? Polly, I've got you on screen, so do you want to kick off?
Well, I'm often asked, I think I would advise people to try and specialise, to acquire, to become a, you don't have to be a specialist from your university degree or whatever, but if you specialise, and it doesn't matter if it's quite a small niche, and you become an expert in something, it might be in health journalism, it might be in something more particular, you gain a kind of weight, a kind of seriousness of reputation that then you can spread out, and you don't have to be stuck in that specialism forever. But otherwise, you're always at risk of being treated rather like Emily said she was, being sent off as the girl reporter to do ridiculous things and not being taken seriously. So get yourself taken seriously in something or another as soon as you can.
Yes, Emily, yes, your anecdote reminded me of that Bridget Jones clip when she comes down the fire and fire.
Yeah. I would add to what Polly said. I would say, as well as kind of specialising, I would say also treat every story with deadly seriousness. Every time, whatever the story is, however small the story is, make sure you have rung, a bunch of people. All those people are future contacts for you for your whole career. If you show yourself to be an honourable and serious journalist to them, it begins building a reputation for yourself. If you've taken that story really seriously, you will understand every word in it. It will all be right. When it goes to the news editor, it will establish your reputation with them, because if they start to kick the tire of a line in the story, you'll have a lot of background behind that one sentence that you wrote. So never just smash something out kind of half considered and half understood. You will regret it. It will bite you in the arse.
Thank you. Helen, what advice would you give?
I mean, I agree with all of that. And also, if you possibly can, go to an institution that will invest in you. I think it's a real problem for young journalists if they end up in places that just want to use them as kind of content farming machines, versus the places that really think about wanting you to have a proper long career and grow you as a person. And the second thing I would say, which I say to all young journalists who ask me, is find out what happens when I Google you and make sure that looks good. Make sure you've got a professional looking Twitter account, you've got a WordPress blog that's, set up with your clips on it, because that's the first encounter that I'm probably going to have with you if you send me, a pitch or you want some help from me or something like that. And it's amazing how many people you just find their old school photos and, weird Instagram pictures of them at the beach, and you kind of like, it's not really giving off the vibes that you probably want here.
Fantastic. There's some top tips there. And actually, Helen, while I've got you, so Richard Rees O'Brien asks, looking a few decades ahead, what are the qualitative as opposed to quantitative changes you would hope to see in mainstream journalism?
Love the qualitative versus quantitative. That's a very difficult one, isn't it? I think I would like it if journalism, if we find it a model for public service journalism that is ultimately sustainable. I think we've been through a very bad 15 years or so in terms of what ad funding has done to journalism, which has encouraged clickbait and conspiracy theory sites and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I feel like the tide is turning. The Guardian's now got a very successful donation model, membership model. The Atlantic, where I work, has got an incredibly successful subscription model, which only launched last year. So we're getting back to the idea that journalism is worth paying for, and journalists are, real specialist journalists who know what they're talking about, are worth paying. And that, to me, is the trend that I would like to see continuing, is the idea that journalism is essential to democracy. Democracy has not had a particularly good few years in lots of countries around the world. And actually, that is the trend that needs to be reversed, and journalism is part of that.
absolutely. Polly or Emily, would you like to add anything?
I don't think she could have said it better. I agree 100%. She's totally right. Taking journalism seriously and journalists taking themselves seriously. Yes.
Great. So Debbie from the LSE Library asks, she said, I'm wondering about assumptions made about women without children in politics and the media too. For example, Theresa May's infertility was dredged up in 2016. Would a man have the same issues kind of held against him? Anyone want to talk about the sort of the representation of women? I mean, either as mothers or not as mothers.
I mean, if you want, I can, as official representative of women without children on the panel, I can probably do that because, yeah, I think it was very unfair. And I think that there is still a problem that women without children particularly are seen as somehow incomplete, you know, that they're not fully rounded people, that they, you know, something is missing from their lives. And actually, occasionally when a particularly nasty bloke tries to bring something down, they sort of say things to me like, you know, your eggs are shrinking and you're going to die alone. And you think, well, you're sending, you know, you're sending hatred to people anonymously on the internet, so I wouldn't necessarily get into that competition of who's going to be most beloved in their older years, sir. But you know, it is a thing that is thrown at women, and it comes back to what Polly was saying right at the start about women being seen as their natural place being in the home and in the domestic sphere, and if they're not there, there's something sort of weird and monstrous about it. But equally well, I don't think it's any better for women who do have children in politics, because, you know, when I did some research once, I discovered that the average number of children that a man in the cabinet had was far more than the average number of children that a woman in the cabinet had. And, you know, if you're a man in politics, having some adorable little children mingling around humanizes you. But, you know, are you there doing the school pickup? And I think both David Cameron and Nick Clegg were quite brave to go into Downing Street saying, actually, we are going to do that. And they got the kind of buckets of ordure that you'd expect from that. But there's still this problem that as a woman, you're screwed either way. Either you're not a full person because you haven't had children, or you've got children and all the hours in the day that those children take up hold you back. So there is no way to win.
No, you're considered that you're not taking life quite seriously, aren't you? If you've got young children, if you're a woman.
I think it's. Can I just say, I think it's interesting the extent to which a couple of decades ago, you would have looked at women who had got to the top, whether in business or journalism or politics, and there would be a surprising number of them who didn't have children, whether that's Margaret Beckett, whether that's, you know, Theresa May, and you go through them, it was odd how many didn't. And I think that's slightly less so now. I think that, you know, it's got a bit easier for women with children to get to those very top jobs. There was, Helen says, you know, probably still fewer of them compared with the men.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I've got a question here which I like because it name checks my book. Kate MacDonald says, after reading Sarah's book about interwar women journalists, I'm interested in feminist leadership in journalism in the regional press. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read that fabulous book by Monica Dickens, My Turn to Make the Tea, where as a regional girl reporter, she was always the one, it was always her turn to make the tea. And my book references a woman called Stella Martin from the Bristol Evening Press. Are there any great women regional journalists, either now or in the past, that you would like to name check or talk about?
That's a very good question, because all the ones that immediately come to mind now are, you know, are men. But for example, someone who's working now, I think is brilliant. Jennifer Williams at the Manchester Evening News.
I'm going to say that myself. Yes.
She's really owned that beat, and actually she shows the power of what it means to know a community. Because when the lockdown restrictions controversy kicked off in Manchester, and obviously Andy Burnham gave his sort of stirring press conference with outside whatever the steps of that was, you know, she was absolutely there, and she's asked questions in the Downing Street press conferences that have been specifically based around her region. And, you know, I know I've got friends who live in Greater Manchester who felt really forgotten. You know, they felt they were in harder tier restrictions, and because London wasn't, basically no one cared. And that again shows to me the point of having local journalism, of having voices in those communities. And she, to me, represents somebody who is grounded absolutely in her community, doing a form of journalism that, as I said before, is essential to democracy.
That kind of journalism is increasingly rare, isn't it? I mean, it just is you know, here where I live in Dorset. Shh, just finally left. Sorry, I knew the dog bark at least once. Sorry.
Okay, we're running out of time, but we do have more. I just try and squeeze in maybe one or two more. So Annalise Edwards asks about abuse of women journalists. She asks, do we know where it's coming from? Is it mainly from men or is it from women? And is it letters? Is it typing? Is it online? Do we know? Do we know where this abuse of women journalists is coming from?
I personally don't get much, but I do occasionally get a letter from a reader blaming me for something that New Scientist did long before I joined, or for a piece I've had nothing to do with, basically blaming, you know, why they don't like that piece on me. But I think that's at the most benign end of the kind of misogyny that's poured at women.
Anyone else want to leap in there before we
I must say, I'm afraid that I think it does come from men and women. I think the fact that it's directed towards women is very noticeable, but there is a big premium on being, and it comes back to what Emily and Polly were saying, the feminism divided. There's a big premium on being the right kind of feminist and being on the right side. And actually, you're never more popular as a feminist than when you're in a cat fight with someone who's deemed to be the wrong kind of feminist. So for as much as I get abuse from sexist men, I get quite a lot of abuse for being the wrong kind of feminist from other women too. So it's not a particularly simple picture.
No. And the last question from Meg Montague actually kind of speaks to this in a way. She says intersectionality was mentioned at the start, and I was wondering what responsibility you think white women may or may not have to ensure women of colour are also represented in newsrooms. Anyone want
Absolutely have responsibility, but I mean, so do men. The idea that women are kind of specially caring and specially nice and specially good and specially socially concerned, given that men still have most of the power, it's even more important that men should be utterly aware of the extent to which ethnic diversity is still thin on the ground. But it's an equal responsibility for men and women.
Yeah, but it is. We've started where I work at New Scientists. We've started a diversity intern scheme. Started last year. We churned out 3 exceptional science journalists from BAME backgrounds last year. 2 of them women. One of whom we've hired. The other 2 we're still using every day. And we've just taken in 3 quite confused new interns who now don't know any of us, or don't know where, you know, never been to the office, whatever. But sort of kind of being able to produce young female science journalists from BAME backgrounds, I think is, even if it's only at the rate of 2 years, I think a big deal. And I intend to keep doing it every year that I'm at New Scientist.
Fantastic. And just to say, I've noticed, as speaking as an academic, I've noticed very much on the other side. Since the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer, I've had lots and lots of publications writing to me saying, can we take your BAME students for work experience, because we realise there's a lot we have to do to increase the diversity in our publications. So people are definitely thinking about it, but it's definitely coming through, but it's obviously a very slow thing. Well, we've run out of time, everybody. So thank you so much for a fascinating discussion about women in journalism. Thank you, Helen, Emily and Polly. And just to tell our viewers, there's now a half an hour break, and then we have another panel on at past to talk about literary journalism, and that's with another fantastic panel. So I hope you'll stay for that. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, sorry about that slight technical hitch. Hello and welcome to this discussion of women publishing and the literary press, the second of two panels live streamed today as part of our Festival of Women Writers and Journalists, a centenary celebration of Time and Tide. For those of you just joining us, my name is Catherine Clay and I'm Director of the Time and Tide Connections and Legacies project. We're here to mark the centenary of feminist magazine Time and Tide and to reflect in this panel on the status of women and of women's writing in the literary and cultural landscape today. As well as promoting women's equality with men in public and political life, Time and Tide was vigorous in its promotion of women writers at a time when papers such as The New Statesman pronounced upon the supposed intellectual inferiority of women and their presumed limitations as artists. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce as our chair of this panel, Rebecca Harding, a highly successful marketing and communications consultant by trade, and the worldwide chairman of the Society of Women Writers and Journalists. This organisation dates right back to the late 19th century, and its members included some Time and Tide early contributors, for example, Vera Brittain and Clemence Dane. It feels particularly fitting to close our programme with this link back to the past through Rebecca's chairmanship of the SWWJ in the present. And without more ado, I'll hand you over to her now so that she may introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Catherine. That was a really nice introduction. I'm definitely coming here again. So thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to the session on women publishing and the literary press. And I've got a great lineup of guests this afternoon. We've got Nicola Bowman, founder of Persephone Books, which reprints neglected mid-20th century fiction and non-fiction by women writers. We've got Thea Lenarduzzi, who's a prize-winning essayist and also commissioning editor at the Times Literary Supplement. And finally, we have Catherine Riley. She's a writer and co-founder of the Prima Donna Festival of Writing, Creativity and Ideas, celebrating diversity, inclusivity and equality. So we'll be having a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions, please remember to put them in at the bottom right-hand side of the screen in the Q&A box or the chat box. So, and also Catherine Clay, whose brainchild this festival is, will come in at the very end of our session to round up the day. And she's not getting away without being asked a few questions as well before we finish. So Nicola, Thea and Catherine, welcome. How are you all?
All right, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Great. So now we've all received this wonderful souvenir copy of Time and Tide, if you can all see that, as part of this centenary event for the magazine. Now, Nicola, several of Persephone Books authors wrote for Time and Tide at some point or other, either as contributors or short stories. So is it exciting for you to see this in print? And was there anything in it that particularly grabbed you? Oh, I can't hear you, Nicola. So, could you unmute?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. We just can't see your lovely face and your lovely background. Can you find the camera? That's it. Brilliant. Excellent. Thanks, Nicola.
Is that better?
Yeah, brilliant. We can see you
Okay.
beautifully.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Well, there's a wonderful review in this facsimile, beautiful facsimile, of A Room of One's Own, by someone rather interesting called Theodora Bozanquet. And I have no idea who she is, but Catherine will tell us. And it's a rather interesting review because it's rather poetic in itself. It's rather long and rambly, and it doesn't really tell you what A Room of One's Own is about, but it's sort of poetry. Did anybody else feel that it was slightly odd in that way?
Yeah, it sort of comes at it from a different
Yes.
Angle, doesn't it? Or not even an angle, it's much more meandering than you might expect.
Yes, and I love that. And yes, it's absolutely thrilling seeing some of our writers. I had this problem, but we'll discuss that in a minute, that I don't think Lady Rhonda was actually a very good judge of literature, which is a very interesting subject because she was a politician, really. And so I don't feel at all happy about one or two of the contributions in this, but that's a whole nother issue that we'll get to about judgment. But yes,
and critique review. Yeah.
Yes.
No, that's great, Nicola. Thank you. What about you, Thea? Was there anything that particularly caught your imagination in there?
Yeah, I loved. There's a short article about Amy Johnson, who had just completed the first solo flight from London to Australia. And the writer says, what Miss Johnson has done, any young woman of like qualities, and there are hosts, can do. It's a question of a certain breakdown, conscious or unconscious, of mental barriers, a release from the conventional idea that piloting an airplane is in the first place a job for the man, and that the endurance and skill and mental balance needed for a flight of 12,000 miles over distant and dangerous lands and sea can never be found in the female. And then she sort of goes on to say, the important and significant aspect of Miss Johnson's flight is that she has demonstrated once and again that the sex division between male and female is absurd and obsolete, that both have to be regarded in the first place as individuals. And I just thought it was interesting to read that a few days after Kamala Harris was voted into the vice presidency in the US. And one of the first stories that the Telegraph newspaper ran with was, the headline was, "Why Kamala Harris is the modern beauty icon the world needs." And it was just that thing of focusing on, not on the individual, but on what gender she is and what color her skin is. And it just reminded me of the way that Amy Johnson was so often treated in her time, when she just pulled off this amazing feat of skill and courage. The Daily Mail, their headline was, she sets off with a closet full of frocks, which was just not even true. But again, we must focus on, they refuse to focus on them as individuals, and they just get completely hooked on their gender.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, your comments about the American situation is absolutely spot on. So what about you, Catherine? Anything that you saw in there?
Just before, we could do an entire panel on Daily Mail headlines about powerful women being reduced to what they were. I remember forget Brexit, what about Lexit headline, which had Nicola Sturgeon and Theresa May in their shoes, which is anyway. Back to my issue of Time and Tide. So I got a bit stuck on the letters pages. So I'm just going to read the entire note that was written by Mr. Groom on the 19th of June 1925, which made me laugh a lot. Sir, I am pleased to note in the current issue of Time and Tide that you are not anxious to be addressed as Madam. I am one of your male readers, and although I know that the journal is conducted by women, I have always admired the clever way in which you have avoided making it a women's periodical. I like it because it is readable and bears no sex label. And so to me, it just made me laugh, because it's that sort of, even though it's written by women, it's actually rather good, like, well done, that kind of really, so it's quite patronizing male tone, and well done on not tainting it as womany. And it really reminded me of one of my favorite Margaret Atwood quotes when she's talking about the difference between the reception of male and female writers. And she says, when a man writes about washing a dish, it's realism. And when a woman does it, it's an unfortunate feminine genetic limitation. And that kind of letter to me summed up the double standard, really, which I'm sure we'll get into later on in this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a brilliant summary. I love the way you put that, because I mean, things have changed. But before we came on air, I was telling a story about something that happened to me yesterday with a man who didn't accept me as an interviewer because I was a woman. So I mean, from your point of view, everyone, How do you feel that women's status in literary review journalism and publishing has changed since the time and tide? So where are we today? Do you want to kick off, Catherine, on where you think we actually are?
I think that we're still, women writers are still grossly disadvantaged by their gender. I think women of colour writers even more so. So I think there have been many examinations of the review press going back through, in the second wave, the Women in Journalism reviewing the reviews paper, which kind of laid it out as a very depressing read about the amount of coverage that women got, the amount of coverage that they wrote as well, which was significantly lower. And I think it's still the same, that this kind of literary double standard that I was trying to pull out with that letter, it's still very much there. So women writers are judged more as, so for example, a writer like David Nichols can write one day and it's literature, but a woman wrote that and it would be romantic fiction. It would be possibly marketed differently, it would certainly be received differently in the review press. So, and I think there's lots of examples. The Amelia report that Danusha Keane wrote last year or the year before had a really excoriating analysis of where women sit in the review press. So Thea knows more than me about this, but I think there's a way to go before we get to a better place. Yeah.
So what about you, Nicola? What do you feel about how things have changed?
I feel there's a way to go before we get to a better place, but I take it for granted. This is the terrible thing about how active is one's feminism. I am so used to it, right back from the days when I was at university and no women writers were considered, apart from George Eliot and Mrs. Gaskell. It was even before the time of Virginia Woolf. It's sort of, I am so used to it that it's just in my DNA. A few things have changed a little bit, but not a lot, is what I would say. But that's very cynical and sad.
Yeah, it is quite sad. I'm hoping that we might have some upbeat notes. Things have improved by the end.
I can't promise to bring anything particularly upbeat because I would tend to agree. I think the novelist actually, so John McGregor, he described how the entire culture, an apparatus, he said, of the published novel, it was developed by an economic elite with leisure time on its hands, he said. And so he talks about how basically the descendants of that class work to perpetuate the environment. And, there have been so many articles written about how you tend to commission in your likeness, in a sense. And within that, you can still, there's been an allowance, and there's been an increasing allowance, but allowance is a kind of interesting word, I think, for people who are what John McGregor calls hyphenated anomalies. So he talks about the working class writer, the black writer, the gay writer, the disabled writer, the woman writer. And there's almost perhaps a worrying sense in which if people can point to one, they'll say, okay, well, we've done that. We've got that. We've done our bit on that for a while now. So we don't really need to worry about maintaining it and keeping up the drive to diversify and stuff. And I just think, it kind of, to make it a bit more personal, I suppose, when I think about my own time coming into the TLS and working in the sector in which I now work, not all that much sometimes can feel like it's changed from accounts that I read that were written in the 70s, for example. We ran a review a few weeks ago of the Fleet Street Girls by Julie Welch. And there's this anecdote that she tells about the day that she made history. She was the first woman to report a football match for a national paper. And so she sits in the box and she hears a voice behind her, "Women in the press box, so it's come to that." And it's just a sense of, I think there is still a residue of the knowing your place and not asking for too much. And I think that does persist.
What we haven't mentioned is the old-fashioned word, the academies. In my view, the canon is dictated by the academies by literary criticism, by academics, and it all filters down from that. And that is changing so slowly. It's still possible for people to do PhDs on subjects that I would think were interesting. They are allowed, obviously, to do Virginia Woolf, and occasionally they're allowed to do PhDs on the middle brow. And oh, we're going to make a special corner for the middle brow. And then there's some women writers that weirdly it's perfectly okay for academics to write about, like Rebecca West or Storm Jameson or Jean Rhys. I don't quite know how they manage it, but they get into that corner. The canon resides.
They're the exceptions.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of wonderful writers who the Academy won't accept. And so I think it isn't just society not allowing women to commentate on cricket or whatever your analogy was, it's academics. And that is because the young academic, and I see it with people who've worked at Persephone and have gone on to be academics, they have to earn their living, they have to play the game, or they're not going to do their PhD and they're not going to get their junior lectureship. So nothing is changing, or rather it's changing, but very, very slowly.
So, I mean, you touch on there issues that you've come across. So what's affected you in your own life, Nicola? What has specifically been your
personal life?
No, just personally, in your own work life. What's affected you?
My first book was about these writers, and it was always considered, well, put it in the corner. They're middlebrow writers. It's completely uninteresting because I'm not an academic. So yes, I do feel quite emotional about that.
Yes, I could see.
And then I always say to my husband, well, I should have been an academic. And he says, you would have absolutely hated it. And I would. And the reason I'm not is because I was bad at exams. So he always says to me, thank God you were bad at exams, because he's very proud of what I've done. So I think it's a very interesting issue. And actually, I don't ever think about academics or reviews, because we never get reviews of our books, almost never. We only get reviews if I happen to know someone who says to me, I will approach the literary editor of whatever, but otherwise we never get reviews. But I never think about it because we are so phenomenally lucky at Persephone with our readership. I mean, I don't have to repeat this, but you know, we sell by mail order. We have 25,000 people on our mailing list, and we keep it at 25,000 because we cull people if they don't buy the books. And so I just don't think about these problems, but they are very, very real and actually upsetting that the world is changing so slowly.
Yeah. So, Catherine, what have you come across in your life that's sort of affected you directly in your experience?
Well, I can certainly relate to, I've done some academic teaching, I can certainly relate to the glacial pace of change in academic departments, which are still dominated by, not to be rude, sort of fusty old men who are quite intimidating to young female academics. And I think there are overlooked writers like Angela Carter, for example, who absolutely should be part of the literary canon. And her omission from the Booker Prize is why we have the Women's Prize for Fiction. But there's so much more work to be done on more contemporary women writers as well that should be canonicized in that way. But I wanted to just make a kind of positive point about that idea of tokenism that Thea was talking about. So the working class writer or the black female writer or whatever. Because one of the things I think we were most proud of at Prima Donna when we ran our first festival last year is that one of our panelists who had participated in a panel with 4 other women of colour, none of them were talking about the fact that they were women of colour on a panel talking about books. What they were actually talking about was their specialism, which was, I think, travel writing. And I'm very sorry if I've got that wrong. There are a lot of panels. But the point that I'm making is that there are spaces to, allow women to have their specialism and to be respectfully treated and listened to in that specialism. But we don't. They're rare and they're few and far between. And we have to make sure whenever we're setting up events like this, we are always looking for the people that aren't at the table and habitually aren't at the table. And that's kind of the work that I'm doing now. I'm lucky to be surrounded by brilliant women all the time. Lucky and perpetually intimidated.
I mean, the only thing is, one would have to say that modern young women are taken seriously by publishers. You know, we can't say that it now, in the 21st century, makes a huge difference if you're a male novelist or a female novelist. Would you agree with that?
What do you think?
I suspect you might get sort of pushed towards writing a different sort of book, depending on whether you're male, female, of colour, working class. I've heard enough stories from people who pitch a book to a publisher and are told, based on who they are and what they look like, well, have you thought about going in this direction instead? So I don't know whether maybe there still is a slight difference in the way that the process of publication would be handled. It's anecdotal, so it's not fully satisfying as an answer, but I suspect there still is a difference.
So Thea, in terms of the TLS, Times Literary Supplement, what sort of challenges do you face in establishing an equal gender split in the publication, either in terms of authors that you're reviewing, or the people that are doing the reviewing, whether they're male or female?
Well, and again, it's sort of split between anecdote and quantifiable stuff. And I guess the quantifiable stuff, the kind of the proven challenges, are the ones that we want to focus on, because they're the ones that we stand more of a chance of having some control over, I suppose. Inevitably, though, the TLS sort of draws its reviewers predominantly from an academic sphere. So I totally, Nicola, what you said completely resonates with me about the narrowness of the academic world. And I do think that we certainly we're doing our best to remedy that. The fact that there are people like me commissioning at the TLS, and I didn't go to Oxbridge. I went to a decent university, but I didn't go to Oxbridge, which is something that I've run up against a number of times with people. I do think it's making a bit of a difference, but yes, we're limited in that we draw from an academic world predominantly. So that world is still disproportionately white and male. And if it's not white and male, it's white and female. Earlier this year, The Guardian published figures that were reported by the Higher Education Statistics Agency. And they reported that male professors continue to outnumber females by 3 to 1. The number of female professors has increased, but it's 1,200, which really doesn't seem very many. It's gone up by 1,200 since 2014. So it is a glacial pace. And among those figures, we also see that overall Black academics make up 2% of the total working at UK universities. So that's the kind of the sphere that we then draw from, more or less. So it does create an added pressure to find the unobvious person, basically, for anything that you want to have written, any book that you want to be covered or whatever. So add to that just kind of wider social pressures, including the economy, austerity, rising unemployment, the pandemic. These things affect certain people more than others. We know this. If childcare becomes too expensive, who's most likely to cut back and sacrifice their academic work or their writing work? If jobs are going to be cut, are they more likely to be the flexi part-time ones or the full-time ones? And all of these things feed into the makeup of an academic sphere that is increasingly driven by market pressures. Universities are run as businesses and they need to get the most out of every recruit. So we're dealing with a really skewed world or kind of reservoir of writers that we would tend to fall back on. And you also have to look at the fact that student dropout rates are on the rise. And I expect, this year is going to be really have a great effect in that sense as well. We're heading for even more challenges. I struggle to feel particularly positive about how representation, how much better we'll be at representation in a year's time than we were a year ago. So
yeah, Sorry, my alarm was going off.
Was it your negativity alarm?
That's brilliant. I love it. No, it's my don't forget your children alarm. It's 4 o'clock.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Point proven. But I was interested in what you were saying about the Oxbridge aspect as well. And it made me wonder whether there are other constraints that affect women where different excuses are used to stop women coming in. Do you feel that's true?
But men are much better at ringing up and saying, can I review this book, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And also, you can, even if they don't ring you and tell you, if you have a book and you're like, oh, I'll get this reviewed by this person. So you email a man. I am so sure that the first man you write to, even if it's not particularly his specialism, will say, yes, I'm qualified to review that. I will take that on. Whereas a woman is more likely to say, oh, I don't actually think I'm the best person to do that. And more often than not, will actually recommend a friend. Yeah. And that's anecdotal, but I've had that so many times.
That's an interesting point, because you're making a point that actually it's politically incorrect to talk about. We can't actually find the words to talk about the temperament of women being different. I don't want to say things, that are going to be recorded that would sound rather odd, but that is the big point, that women tend to ring you up less to say, could I review a book?
But that's not something innate. That's something that centuries and centuries of social socialization have done. So there was I was on a panel a few years ago, and the veteran news reporter Penny Marshall, amazing Penny Marshall, was on this panel, and she had a line to synthesize the hurdles that she had encountered, and that pretty much everyone on that panel, it was women working in broadcasting, had faced. And she said, tits, tots, and tar. Tits, as in the first thing is you will be judged on your appearance. Tots, you'll have to juggle having a family. Yeah. And then tar, as in tar very much. The idea that we should be grateful to be there at all. And I wonder if that isn't particularly acute in the world of working with books, because we already feel so lucky that we get to do that as a job.
But this will change. This will change. I'm sorry, I'm probably older than all of you. You mustn't be too impatient. Things are changing. And now we need to mention what we haven't already mentioned, is people's fathers. Okay? It's people's fathers can be incredibly influential in how much get up and go they have and how much women want to go out into the world. And actually, we haven't mentioned Margaret Ronda's father. And Tide, because obviously this panel is talking about something else. But it's a subject which I find incredibly interesting, about women and money inherited from their fathers, and the effect of their father on their relationship with the world. So it is.
I think it's a great point, actually, because I know that in terms of business world as well, they're using the fathers of daughters to try and influence change within the business context, to try and increase diversity. So it's a really interesting point. What do you think, Catherine?
I think, why not the mothers of daughters to try and change? I don't understand. I mean, without getting into psychological theory, which is definitely my specialism.
That will happen. But in the last decades, it's been the men who've left the women the money. That is changing, obviously, but it takes a while. But all the literary endeavours that I can think of run by women have been funded by their fathers, and it's not something that we can talk about, because
Well, I don't think that's true either. There are phenomenal literary endeavours like Virago Press, for example, that was set up in 1973 and continues to this day, publishing women, has uncovered, like you, many kind of forgotten female writers.
It may not have been their fathers that funded it, but
it definitely wasn't.
I can name you the men who funded it. So my point is made. But it's changing. In 50 years, that won't be so anymore. But Virago was funded by men. So partly. I'm sorry to say that.
Partly.
well.
I think in the business context it's a bit different. It's more about getting men to actually lead the influence with other men, and to change other men's opinions. So I kind of see where Nicola's coming from as well. But why do you think that it does, Catherine, why do you think that review press does remain so male dominated, and why does it really matter?
It matters because it goes back to this issue of gatekeeping that we've talked about. So if male authors are more likely to be published in hardback books are more likely to be reviewed, men are therefore reviewed, and it maintains the literary sphere as a kind of male sphere, and those are the books as we've talked about that get put in the canon and revered.
Yeah.
It matters because it has a material impact. Women writers earn a quarter less than men, their male counterparts. It has writing is a business for a very few lucky people, and so those material things do matter. It matters that women's voices aren't in the public sphere. There are fewer call sheets when people at the BBC need an expert. It has a huge impact, a knock-on effect, that women aren't taken seriously by the review press across not only literary culture but culture more generally, I think.
That's a very interesting point about the hardbacks, because for years and years I've said we just must abolish the system of having things in hardback and 9 months later, that like a child, the paperback, but I'd never thought about it benefiting men. It's a really interesting point.
If anything, just from an environmental perspective as well, like it just seems absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, can you imagine how much the new biography by Hermione Lee of Tom Stoppard must weigh? I mean, I haven't seen it, but
it's enormous. Yes,
900 pages. It's nuts, isn't it?
I'm trying to read Hilary Mantel's latest book, and just in terms of the sheer physical effort of holding it up, it's an effort. It's an exhausting effort so far.
Yeah, I was still trying to make my way through that one actually. So, I mean, in terms of like sort of where we go and in terms of making changes, what do you think really works in terms of making things more integrated with women coming in? What do you think, Thea? Because you've done quite a lot on the Times in terms of changing things. What actually works?
At the TLS, yeah, I can't speak for the Times. Yeah. I don't know what they.
No, I mean I meant the Times literally.
But the TLS, yeah. I mean, I think the things that we found, we've only been collecting data since 2015, but I think that really has had a really, really notable change because we can map it, we can see it. So for all of the anecdote and kind of, social theorizing that you do, when you can see numbers there, that changes things. So we started collecting data with a view of parity. So 50-50 male, female in the paper. We started in September 2015, and the figures from there go to mid 2016. And it looked like this. It was male 64%, female 36%. And that was in spite of some editors really consciously trying to address the situation by, when you're presented with a known, looking harder, finding someone less obvious, rooting around in academia or wherever to find these people. So that was 64-36. By 2017, it was 57-43, 2018, 52-48, 2019, 51-49. Yeah. So we've not got the numbers for this year, but you can see a clear improvement. And I think this tells us a number of things. One, that the compiling of data, as I said, people's perception of what they commissioned was wrong, but they weren't able to see it unless we had actual numbers to show them. But people have a very skewed sense of who they are and of what they do and how they commission. So the data really helped. Two, leadership. One of the things that changed in this time was we acquired a new editor who deliberately selected every issue, or the pieces for every issue, with a view to reaching a gender balance. Three, monitoring and consent. People have to be on board with why they're doing it, why it matters, and the way that you're going about it. But I think, so conscious effort, basically, conscious effort we're talking about. But I think, and this comes back to what Catherine was saying, the major thing that still really, really needs to change, and I don't know how this will happen necessarily, but there's an ad in Time and Tide in this centenary edition. On the front page, it says, "Write your way to success." And it's this idea that it's an alternative revenue stream for anyone who wants to give it a go. But, you know, I think most people who are coming from an atypical for the industry background, say they didn't go to the right university, or they didn't grow up in a house full of books or whatever, they're probably not going to get through to someone who'll give them a chance. And even if they do, our sector pays people so poorly, for the most part, a token amount quite often, that simply isn't going to be, it's not writing, publishing isn't going to be an option for people who need to also pay bills. And you know, basically, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure what we're talking about when we're talking about getting more people of colour, non-males, people from working class backgrounds into print, it's still along the lines of what Virginia Woolf wrote about all those decades ago: space, money, and respect. So
that's very interesting. That's a really good summary. What about you, Catherine? What do you agree, and what do you feel are the biggest challenges in terms of publishing becoming more representative and inclusive?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Thea just said. And some of the things that we're trying to do at Prima Donna is to create those spaces and channels that just aren't there yet. So we set up the Prima Donna Prize last year when we set up the festival, and it's for unagented and unrepresented writers who've never published before. And it's the reason we think it's important is because, exactly as Thea just said, those are exactly the people that just wouldn't find their way to an agent, wouldn't find their way through an agent to a publisher. We wouldn't hear their stories, and they would never become an established writer. So the prize, the last year's winner, a Glaswegian working class non-writer, she won our prize because she wrote a fantastic piece of a section of her novel, which is now going to be published in full length by HQ Stories in 2022. So that for us is a massive win. You know, she's a new voice. She's talking about stuff, issues, scenarios, experiences that are not often heard through mainstream press, publishers. And so there's stuff to be done like that, you know, innovative stuff. And one of my sister prima donnas, Kit Duvall, set up, with her first advance for a book, set up a scholarship at Birkbeck for a working class writer to do a creative writing course. So, you know, people lifting each other up like that is really important. But we need much more than that. We need systemic change. You know, the boardrooms of mainstream publishers were at the turn of the millennium quite female dominated. They're not anymore. It's straight, white, middle class men with the money power, and that's what drives what gets published and what we read, and that's the stuff that has to change as well.
And sorry, yeah. But also beyond that, we're how many, more than a decade of government that doesn't really value the art, not in a sense that to put money behind it. So we're stuck in a society that doesn't think that art should be paid for, and that of course has a limit on who's going to be able to create it.
And do you think that the current COVID situation, because people have got very used to having these sorts of things, trips to museums, online, and is this actually going to be quite detrimental for women's literature in terms of getting people to feel even more that things should be free?
It's detrimental to all women in culture and arts, because when there's any kind of crisis, women are the first ones that have to pick up the childcare, that have to pick up the kind of freedoms that they had earned to maybe be out of the house working and to employ somebody else to clean. Those are the things that go first. And so, yeah, it's harder, not just for women writers, but women across the arts to do what they want to do right now. And it will only get worse before it gets better. Sorry, this is not the happy
negativity alarm.
Sorry, it's not going off. It's not going off. We're fine. But I was interested, Catherine, what you were saying about the awards, because that sounds fantastic. It really does, and obviously do some really good work. But I know that when women win literary awards for fiction, I know Nicola Griffiths wrote about this, it's usually for writing from a male perspective and or about men. And she said the more prestigious the award, the more likely the subject of the narrative will be male. So what do you think about that? What do you think, Nicola, about the awards that are given out and the way it's done. You got any thoughts?
I don't have a clue.
What about you, Thea?
Ask someone else about present day awards.
I feel quite torn about awards, and I'm speaking as someone who won one like relatively recently, not a major one, but still, you know, it makes you feel visible and it's very exciting.
Yeah.
But I wonder about the I think the thing that I worry about is when awards are created with really specific remits, that quite often people can say, well, they're taking care of that, they're looking after that, so we don't have to. That award exists, or even that imprint exists, so that's fine. We'll continue to do what we do, and they've got that sorted. I always remember worrying a bit about the Women's Prize for Fiction, because of the kind of the concern that it sort of ghettoizes and kind of perpetuates that sense of these are women's books for women, written by women for women, rather than just being considered as books by individuals. But I also understand that sometimes it's a necessary part of a process towards the ultimate goal, which is invisible, invisibility almost. You're just an individual rather than a man or a woman or transgender or whatever, you know. So yeah, I feel an ambivalence about
I think that the way that awards are helpful are as almost like as a kite mark for the reader. So in an industry that churns out 200,000 new novels every year, that's an impossible market to get into as a reader who just wants to be presented with something good. So it's almost so, and we know that the impact of being longlisted or shortlisted for the Booker, but also for the Women's Prize and the Jallet Prize, means that you will have an immediate uplift as a writer in sales, and that's significant. It's important. So if there are prizes, I totally get what you mean about tokenism, absolutely. And I remember speaking to Sarah Waters, and obviously she is a gay woman writing sometimes about gay themes, but she said she really struggles with that. Do I want to just be on the shelf as a writer, or do I want to appeal to that specific, it's a difficult thing. But the thing that prizes do is they monetize your work more effectively, and just in a crass materialistic way. That's a good thing. It's a good thing if there's a prize that's focusing on writers of color, because they'll sell more books, and that's a good thing. So, and it's a good prize if it's a good thing if there's a prize for women, because they'll sell more books, and that's, to me, is a good thing as well.
That's because we've gone down the road of reviews and prizes. Books could be sold in another way.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean that was
example, in the 50s and 60s, the Penguin catalogue came out 2 or 3 times a year, and that was a huge marketing tool, because one got the catalogue and thought, what's in Penguin now? There are just so many other ways books could be sold rather than just reviews and prizes.
Well, that's how you go about it, isn't it, Nicola? Because I was waving this on the screen before.
This sounds incredibly arrogant, and please don't think I'm not being modest. But I do sometimes wonder why other publishers don't do it. I mean, it's so cheap. Every time we send out a biannually twice a year, we get 1,500 orders straight off, which pays for the book. And then, so we print 3,000 copies of every book. And then if we see that another 1,500 copies is going to sell pretty quickly, then we order a reprint. Why is this such a peculiar thing that no other? It's a mystery to me.
I wonder if it's because, and this, I'm just making this up as I go along, but I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that the publishing world has become so kind of consolidated around giants. So you've got Penguin, Random. So if they were to have a catalogue, it would be enormous. So they'd have to break it down by imprint. But what works so well for a publisher like Persephone or Fitzcarraldo or the indies, the smaller presses, Favour even, is that they have such a loyal following of readers. People know, if if a book comes out published by Persephone, I'll probably really like that. I would like to have that. So there's a loyalty. Whereas with something like Penguin, it's so diffuse and they publish everything that there's no purchase.
They capitalise on their brand more. I mean, Favour, for example, when they used to be in Queen Square, I always used to think that there should have been a shop on the ground floor instead of just a receptionist and nothing else. Well, why don't they build their brand more?
Sounds like you need to go in as a consultant.
I was just going to say that.
I don't agree. We've done what we're doing for the last 20 years. They too could have done it if they wanted to. There are reasons they're not doing it, and I know what those reasons are. Which it's to do with, tying up everything with the big boys, but
But this is getting into sort of really good ideas about how things can be done differently. And I wonder if there are ideas that you have about how the future could be better for women. What could be positively done? What do you think it would be great ideas? And do you think there are real opportunities for women that will develop over the next sort of 20, 30 years? So Catherine, sorry, Nicola, you go ahead.
No, I was only going to say I don't want to be obsessed with the money. But since I run a business which is in profit, I think the money thing is absolutely crucial. And not until women can reliably run businesses which are in profit will things change enough. That's my view. It's to do with with being independent from men, because you don't need their.
I'll cheer you up, Nicola, because I run a business and I'm in profit. I
don't, and I'm not.
And I can guarantee there are a lot of us around, so we've got quite a big network.
I know there are, but I do think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. What about you, Catherine? What do you think is good and bright for the future or could be done?
I think that not only do we need to diversify what is read and who writes, but I think we also the publishing industry still remains overwhelmingly white, middle class, urban, affluent, and there's just too little happening there. We talked about academia and the 2% of professors that are people of color, and the same. I mean, I don't know what the stats are in the publishing industry, but I know that people of color are grossly underrepresented at all levels. And, it's that horrible adage, you have to see it to want to be it. And I think that there's so much more that can be done and should be done to diversify the industry itself, as well as, the work that's coming into it to be published.
Are you hopeful though?
Of course, that's why we set up Prima Donna. It's like a little ray of sunshine. That's, sorry, I shouldn't, that was a really depressing note to wrap up on. Yes, of course I am. Our festival, we had our first festival last summer, and we had a virtual festival this year, and we'll come back bigger and better next year. And we were overwhelmed not only with the writers of all kinds that wanted to be at the festival, their generosity in being available. So one of the USPs was that you could as a punter literally just go and speak to Elif Shafak or Bernardine Evaristo, and there was no kind of, I mean, it must have been quite terrifying for them, but it all went well. But it was an amazing way to connect to ideas and creatives and creativity. And you could also more pragmatically go and meet an agent and talk about your work and find those channels into kind of progressing your own career as a budding writer. And of course. I mean, I'm optimistic.
Great. What about you, Thea? Just before we go to questions.
I would say I'm hopeful, but alert, which sounds like something the government would say. Hopeful, but alert. Wash your hands.
I think you've got a whole new job of opportunity there.
Hopeful but alert. There's so much to do, and that's in the industry, but it's also on a much wider social scale, and we need structures and we need support. And yes, Nicola, we need money. We need all of it. Yeah. We really do. So hopeful but alert.
Right, that's great, guys. Are you up for answering some questions now? So I'm just going to have a look and see what we've had come through. So how long did it? Oh, Nicola, this is one for Nicola. How long did it take you to build up your mailing list, Nicola?
Oh, well, about as long as it took us to pay off the seed money, which came from a man, 3 years.
Yeah, it does. The mailing list can be quite a challenge.
It's an interesting subject that we really should return to one day, about the money. You know, I've made it sound so superficial and glib, but actually it's at the root of everything, really.
Well, and it's the structure of society. It's where the power lies, is where the money is, and we know that it's an incredibly unequally distributed. So it stands to reason that there's truth in what you say.
But it doesn't have to be. I mean,
no, absolutely not. God, no.
Important. And then there's so many other fascinating issues, like I'm allergic to red tape and bureaucracy. And I actually find it's incredibly easy to circumvent it. But that's quite a male thing, isn't it? Anyway, there's so many interesting issues. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. We've got some other questions. We've got another one for you, actually. I'm going to have to put my glasses on because it's a little bit too far away and I'm a little bit too old now to read it at this distance. So, Nicola, can you tell us more about the process of choosing which books to publish at Persephone? We all want to know this. So, and that's
well, actually,
Faye Hamill.
We do have a thing on our website called How We Choose Our Books, because it is the question we're asked most often. But for the purposes of this panel, you will have noticed it's not just women. We do have our male authors who we love. That's partly because Forster, E.M. Forster, is our lodestone. He's absolutely my favourite. And it would be absurd, therefore, not to have some male authors. But also, we're not the kind of feminism that rules out men. We're the kind of feminism which just equality is the only thing that matters, and therefore our male writers, which are about 10%, are as equal as the female ones. And other ways of choosing our books, well, look at the piece on our website. There is
I have to say, Nicola, you seem to have your fan club here this afternoon, because we've got someone else who said, hello, Nicola, lovely to see you. And this is Mary Giuano. So it's lovely to see you, and congratulations on on setting up a brilliant publishing house. I'm a huge fan of Persephone. Please can you tell me which title you would choose to send as a present to someone aged 8 and someone aged 80? Great question. I love that.
Aged 8, we don't have anything. And aged 80, all our books. But if she hasn't read any of them, she could read our bestseller, Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, which is everybody loves.
Oh, that's great. That's really good. So now Faye Hamill, she says, this one for everybody. So when I noticed that I've accidentally not included any male writers on my reading list for a particular course in the English department, should I fix this? Good question.
Add some E.M. Forster.
Oh, it's a great question. Right, Marianne van Remoetel, it's Dutch name, van Remoetel. I'm not very good at Dutch. This one language I can't pronounce. She says, thinking about publishing and reviewing as positions of power, I was wondering where and in what ways you feel you're making a real difference. So, Catherine, do you want to kick off with that?
Sorry, yeah, can you just tell me the question again?
Yeah, thinking about publishing and reviewing as positions of power, I was wondering where and in what ways you feel you're making a difference.
So we, in my work with Prima Donna, I hope we're making a difference in multiple ways. Platforming writers of all kinds and all genders that wouldn't necessarily make it to other literary festivals, creating new methods and channels for for aspiring writers to get published, creating a prize that allows, actually I forgot to mention that one of the things about our prize is that we offer a bursary now of £200. So if you're shortlisted for our prize, you get £200 to create time and space to write your final submission. So things like that make a significant difference when you are, the desperate writer in the garret trying to eke out, any 20-minute gap so that you can finish your work. So I hope that Prima Donna and others like us are making a tangible, positive difference.
Yeah, and I do think though that, you know, sort of £200 of the prize and things, I think that support makes a real difference, because I'm a business writer, so my books are all business. So the kind of thing that, you know, if you want to get your granny to sleep after Christmas, you know,
that's not the actual prize. I should be clear. That's just to help you get to the prize. The prize, you win an actual person, you win an agent.
But I've started doing creative writing, and I'm doing a course, but it's really difficult finding the time amongst around the children, and because I'm a single parent as well, and it is really tough. So actually, little things that help make a big difference.
I think as soon as there's financial value added to something, it just legitimizes it in a way, and it makes you think, yes, I can spend some time on that because someone has recognized that it has a value.
Yes, that is absolutely
the way you frame it.
Yeah, that is such a good point, because even in my own head as a woman, I think, oh, I'm not earning for this. This is not priority. This, you know, I have to put the kids first, this first, that first. And you do, particularly, and I think women really do that. So, right, Sharon Robinson says, what impact do you think e-publishing makes in terms of the gatekeeping effect that Catherine talks about? So, Thea, do you want to have a go at that?
I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that one.
Yeah,
I don't. I wouldn't know where to start. I imagine it might make a difference because it takes so much of the financial risk out of something. Maybe that would mean that people are much more willing to take a punt. But I don't know. It
does make a difference to women writers. Women writers are much more likely to self-publish, and I think I do have some stats, but not on me, about the number of sales have gone up exponentially each year. So self-publishing used to be, you know, denigrated, I think, as a project. And I don't think it's that anymore. I think there's a growing appetite for it, and a growing respect for that channel of getting your work out there.
And I suppose the advent as well of crowdfunding platforms must have made a difference. Things like Unbounded, where people who wouldn't normally find their way, as you were saying before, Catherine, to an agent and a publisher and so on, get to pitch direct to the public, and that seems to have had made a real difference.
It's interesting about the e-publishing, because for the Society of Women Writers and Journalists, we've just started doing some courses on self-publishing for exactly the things that Catherine was saying, that the sales have gone up tremendously, and it's not looked on in the same way that it used to be, and it's actually really popular. Everybody's really keen on doing it, and I think it goes back to what you were saying there about it being all sort of powerhouse publishers now. It's actually a lot harder to get your toe in the door when you're starting out. So it's interesting that that's where we're getting all the interest at the moment with our courses. Lydia Syson, she says, any thoughts about the growing gap between the incomes of male and female authors identified by the AILCS survey? I think it was a year and a half ago, wasn't it? Along with a drastic drop in income across the board. What do you think about that? So, Nicola, have you got any thoughts about that?
Not only that I think it's improving, but I've got no statistics. But my instinct is it's improving. When I wrote a book about the novelist Elizabeth Taylor, she earned perfectly sensible sums of money from her novels. And that was in the 50s and 60s, you know. So I'm not quite sure whether it's I don't know, you know.
I think what Thea said before was important, which is data counts. So that doing the research, finding out that, you know, that all the pay gap reporting that's going on now, that's a legal requirement, is really, really important and significant in revealing where the gaps are and forcing change. And before that, I mean, it's not perfect legislation by any means, but it does push things along if things are legislated in that way. And data is how we identify the problem and solve it.
Yeah,
it does remind me though of 5 years or so ago. Do you remember there was that story, the Government Equalities Office, which was headed by a woman at the time? It was in the news for failing to recruit enough women to senior positions, and then paying men £2 per hour more than the women who were doing the same work. And that was in, 2015 or 16 or something. So keep hopeful but alert, or whatever it was.
I think that's the motto. Yeah, that's got to be the motto.
I'll get the t-shirts printed. I'll put them in the post. You'll have them by the weekend.
Excellent. And a final question. So, as a writer, what would attract you to a publisher? Let's Ellie Reid asking us that. Just so, who'd like to have a bash at that? Catherine?
As a writer, what would attract me to a publisher?
To a publisher, yeah.
Them publishing my work. Simple as that.
I was going to say
yeah.
What about you, Thea?
I think, well, I mean, my only experience is of one book that I've been commissioned to write by one publisher. So it's a bit of what Catherine said, the fact that they're interested in publishing me at all. But also, I suppose, the fact that they're an independent, it's Fitzcarraldo Editions, they're an independent publishing house. I know that they're interested and involved, and when they ask me about my work, they ask me all the right questions. I feel that they're connected with it and they actually care. They're invested in it, and it's not just a financial gamble that they're taking, because we're talking about very small sums and probably only my parents will buy the book. They're not getting free copies.
Absolutely not.
I think it's about having a good relationship, basically having a good relationship and trusting their judgment. And I want to be edited, I suppose, because I am an editor. I think that's a really important part of any publishing process. So someone who I feel confident knows what I'm driving at, probably better than I do.
That's great. What about you, Nicola? Anything to add on that?
And watching my children, 3 of whom are writers, they all are published by smaller publishers, which is so much better. Yeah, it's the relationship.
That's really interesting. So do you think it's your influence that's turned them into all into writers?
No, I think it's genetic. All that influence. In other words, it wasn't me, but it's in the genes.
Well, presumably growing up being surrounded by books will have made a difference.
Yes. Well, also it's again, my anti-bureaucracy thing did not encourage my children to be lawyers or doctors or accountants. Unfortunately.
Oh, that's brilliant. And on that note, I'm going to bring Catherine Clay back in, who I think is there. Are you there, Catherine? Hello.
Oh, just arriving now. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, so I mean, this has been great fun. I'm sure you've been listening in, and it's been a really good session. The guys have been fantastic. But what made you? I mean, the whole event has been your brainchild. So, what made you feel that a conference like this was important to put on?
Yes, well, I'm just thrilled. I mean, for me, this festival was important because Time and Tide was such an important magazine in its day. And yet, like so many cultural texts produced by women, it's sort of been, fallen out of sight in the historical record. So that, the centenary of Time and Tide's first publication this year was just such an opportunity to kind of make its history more widely known to a broader audience, but also to invite a conversation about women's position in journalism and the wider print marketplace and the literary marketplace that I've just been talking about in this panel. Just seemed a great opportunity to bring that history into dialogue with the present. So yeah, thrilled.
Yeah, and you feel that you've actually achieved that and the day's gone well for you?
Definitely. I mean, really the purpose of the event was to make Time and Tide's history more widely known, to kind of create that dialogue. And for me, what was particularly thrilling was seeing the contributors in our panels, in both panels, kind of engaging with the historical contents of our souvenir edition and the kind of connections that sparked for them as they brought their own perspectives from their own experience of working as journalists, as publishers, as editors, as writers, and making that kind of those historical sources relevant. So yeah, I'm just really thrilled by that opportunity, and would like to just remind all audience members that the souvenir edition is there available digitally on our website, and is also available to purchase in print format now as well from our publisher Five Leaves Bookshop in Nottingham.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it is a beautiful publication. It's really nice to have. So I was pleased with my copy. So what has really jumped out today for you? What's been your favourite thing from today?
There have been so many things that have jumped out. I think one of the things in the kind of first panel about the kind of fact that the kind of questions that Time and Tides writers were writing about and exploring were not new questions. They're not new questions today, you know, that we're still dealing with some of those questions of inequality in relation to pay, to childcare. And in this panel, the kind of question of money that's become so, you know, been such as a prominent sort of, that women are still kind of grappling with those very kind of material factors that sort of affect whether they advance or not in both political and cultural spheres. So yeah, that's one of the things that leapt out. I suppose the other thing was I think it was Helen Lewis's comment in the first panel about journalism is not a luxury. Journalism is worth paying for, and it's kind of essential to democracy, and that very much chimes with Time and Tides ethos. One of its kind of marketing slogans was that a weekly review is not a luxury, it's a necessity, and that sort of sense of kind of needing to kind of defend good quality journalism. That's another thing that sort of emerged for me today.
That's good. And what do you feel about the future? What are your thoughts on the future, which we were discussing at the end?
I don't feel qualified to speak about the future.
Well, I don't think anyone is at the moment, but the government's making a good job of trying to.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose I can speak a little bit from in terms of the academic context. That's another really interesting thing that emerged from the panel, that, you know, your discussion just now, and the kind of glacial pace of change in relation to you know, sort of changing the canons, sort of, kind of admitting kind of women writers a lot, you know, aside from the kind of usual suspects like Virginia Woolf, but kind of opening up all those kind of wonderful women writers that Nicola publishes with Persephone. That, you know, that is changing. I run a course on British women writers between the wars at my university. Students, one of the other purposes of this website is that, and this project, is we really want to make, you know, we're developing teachers' resources. We want kind of students and teachers to kind of engage with this history and start making an impact on the curriculum through kind of making, kind of a wider access to these materials and to this literature.
No, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for setting up today and doing everything that you've done. I'm sure we've all really enjoyed it and really enjoyed being part of your work and what you've achieved. So I'd just like to finally thank Nicola Bowman, Thea Lenarduzzi, and Catherine Riley and Catherine Clay. Obviously, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you this afternoon. Thank you so much for your input, and thank you everybody for coming along and listening to us. So I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.